reservations. In exchange for taking native land, government reservations were given to people to live on for as long as they wanted to. The nations were also granted a supply of food and other things they needed as long as they needed to stay on the reservation. In the beginning, native people were allowed to leave their reservation to hunt buffalo. But soon that changed, and anyone caught off reservation was considered hostile and could be shot. The system was unjust and meant native people lost their freedom and dignity. Sometimes they also their will to live. Missionaries and government agents wanted to wipe out native cultures, so many children were separated from their parents and made them attend special schools. It was hoped they would find influenced by old ways of their people.
Why did Native people hate living on reservations so much? Asked Digby. I meant loss of freedom, said Colonel Carbuncle, and no one likes to lose their freedom. They were used to roaming the plains, hunting for buffalo, and they wanted to keep on doing it. Not only that, but the reservations got smaller and smaller, added Mr. Rumage. Some nations ended up with plots of useless land they couldn't hunt on. So they were forced to depend on handouts from the government. It was a sad end to their way of life, and even Sitting Bull had to come to a reservation in the end, said Hannah. Yes, said Mr. Rumage, although he asked to be sent to Little Missouri River near the Black Hills, but the government wanted him where they could keep an eye on him, so they sent him to the Standing Rock Reservation in South Dakota. Later they moved him farther down the river to Fort Randall. He and his Hank Papas were held there as prisoners of war for 2 years. That's terrible, cried Hannah. The government should have been ashamed of themselves. Later many people were, but before that happened, living conditions got steadily worse. Sitting Bull was eventually free, but he was forced to work in the fields, which was no place for a proud Sioux, let alone the greatest chief.
Didn't Sitting Bull join Buffalo Bill's Wild West show? Asked Hannah. He did indeed, replied Mr. Rumage. In fact, he was the star attraction. Wow! I bet he liked that. I know, I would, said Digby enthusiastically. Come on, scowled Hannah. He was a great leader. Can you imagine a king acting in a play about the royal family? He must have hated that. You may be right, Hannah said. Colonel Carbuncle, he was paid $50 for riding once around the arena. Then he got tips for signing his autograph. It was mighty undignified, if you ask me. He agreed to do one season, but then he said his people needed him at home. He'd been shocked by the different way of life, you see, added Mr. Rumage, especially the poverty of neglect he saw in the cities. He once said to sharpshooting Annie Oakley, the famous cowgirl, the white man knows how to make everything, but he doesn't know how to share it. Showman. Buffalo Bill's Cody show featured sharpshooting, racing, and rodeo events. Sitting Bull put on his war headdress and warrior clothes and stared in recreations of battles. He'd actually fought in like Custer's Last Stand, except that time Buffalo Bill would ride and save the day. Most native people who joined up with Buffalo Bill did so to escape life on the reservations and to earn money. Sitting Bull, however, gave most of his earnings away. Cody exaggerated to the lifestyles of native people to make his show more dramatic. Despite this, he is said to have always treated the native people with great respect. Apparently, Sitting Bull called him his friend, and there are a lot of photographs of them standing together. by Grand River. When Sitting Bull returned from the show, he lived in a cabin on Grand River near his birthplace. He still refused to live by the government's rules, although he did agree to send his sons to school. He believed the next generation of Sioux should be able to read and write, but he advised his people to take from American culture only those things that were useful and to leave the rest alone. Land grab. In 1888, the government wanted more land for settlement. It decided to carve up the Great Sioux Reservation into 6 smaller reservations. Sitting Bull tried to persuade the native leaders that they were being swindled, but it worked, and the commissioners had to return to Washington empty-handed. But after more threats, the land was eventually sold, and Sitting Bull's reservation was broken up.
Was that the end of Sitting Bull? Asked Digby. Not quite, replied Mr. Rummage. About a year after the breakup, a Sioux called Kicking Bear came to talk to Sitting Bull. He told him about a wise leader called Wavuka who taught a dance called the ghost dance. What's a ghost dance? Is it spooky? Asked Digby. Kicking Bear said it was a religious ceremony, replied Mr. Rummage. Apparently, Wavuka told his followers to dance in circles until he said it was enough. Then he'd tell them what it meant. Sounds weird to me, said Hannah. Well, the government thought it sounded dangerous and that the ghost dance was really a kind of war dance, continued Mr. Rummage. After all, Wavuka did say that one day fresh grass would grow on the plains, bringing great herds of buffalo, and that the warriors who'd been killed in battle would rise up and join the living. He also foretold that they would have their land back and that the settlers would disappear. Who'd believed all that? Said Hannah. Many plains nations did. To them, it meant hope after losing their freedom and way of life, said Mr. Rummage. But it sure scared the government, especially when they found out Sitting Bull was involved. Adding, the colonel didn't do him much good. Those stories tell how the old chief had one last vision, something it to do with a lark's song. A few years before, he dreamt a meadowlark had told him, "Your own people will kill you." And it turned out the darned bird was right.
Ghost dance threat. The authorities were afraid that the ghost dance might spark a new native uprising. They didn't realize that the Wavuka had said that no violence was to be used to make change, that the ghost dance was enough. Once they heard that Sitting Bull was involved, they decided to send native police to arrest him. On December 15, 1890, 43 police officers surrounded Sitting Bull's cabin. Lieutenant Bullhead went in and asked the chief to accompany him. When Sitting Bull walked outside, a crowd of ghost dancers had gathered. A voice shouted not to go, and so he hesitated. Then the police began forcing him to his horse. A gunshot sounded, then another. Sitting Bull was shot through the head and killed by the police. The meadowlark's prophecy had come true. Who was to blame? Some newspapers reported that Sitting Bull had been killed because he knew the government and native agents had been making secret deals about how native people should be treated. In any event, his killing by native police allowed the government to claim that the native people themselves were responsible. Wounded Knee. The final defeat of the Sioux people took place at Wounded Knee Creek. On December 28, 1899, about 300 Sioux men, women, and children were massacred at the hands of American soldiers.
That's really sad, said Hannah. Sitting Bull's
poor people left without a home, and their way of life gone forever. It was a terrible tragedy, agreed Mr. Rumage. In just a few years, the Sioux nations, along with a whole lot of other native people, were almost destroyed. And they'd have all disappeared if some of those bluecoats had their way, barked Colonel Carbuncle. Nations left, aren't there? Said Digby. Oh, yes, it took time, but native people gradually organized themselves into true nations once again. The Sioux are a good example, said Mr. Rumage. And don't forget the Iroquois. They're still here, added the colonel. In fact, many nations are winning back land that was taken from them illegally. I can't wait to show everyone my tomahawk and tell them all about Sitting Bull and Digby. Come on, Sitting Antique Hunter, said Hannah, leading Digby away. If you don't get home for lunch, someone's going to get into trouble, and it won't be me.
Buried of a chief. Sitting Bull was buried without tribal songs or ceremonies at Fort Yates in North Dakota, but he is remembered today as a great and inspirational leader as well as a brave warrior. He never gave in to the demands of the American soldiers and learned not to trust the government's promises. He was revered as the chief of chiefs among the Sioux and led his people, the Hunkpapas, with as much care and consideration as he could. Only their hunger and poverty drove him to surrender to the American military, the last Sioux warrior to do so. Sitting Bull speaks. When I was a boy, the Sioux owned the world. The sun rose and set on their land. They sent 10,000 men to battle. Where are these warriors now today? Who slew them? Where are our lands? Who owns them?